Thank you. Mr. Ashcraft, you may continue with your direct examination.
Thank you, Judge. Judge Green, let's move now to June of 2018. You have mentioned this month already a couple of times in your testimony thus far. The first time you mentioned it, you mentioned the date June 22 of 2018. Tell us why you mentioned that date and what was important about that day.
On June 22 of 2018, I took Gary Sr. and Katie to the hospital. Katie had some sort of heart condition that required a procedure to repair. And when I was bringing them back home, and I understood that Mr. Cross, Theo Cross, was babysitting all of the children, including Daisy. So there were 5 children while we were away. When we came back to the house, I was dropping Gary Sr. and Katie off. The police were there. I believe that CPS was there too when we arrived, but they may have come soon after. And but they were leaving at that point. They weren't in the house. And I learned later that there had been a complaint that.
Objection to the hearsay.
Response, Mr. Ashcraft.
Judge, she's not testifying about a specific statement. The truth of the matter asserted in it, just why the CPS people and the police were there when she dropped off.
All that needs to be said is there was a complaint made and they investigated.
Mr. Ashcraft, would you please reword your question to get to what you're trying to bring in?
Thank you, Judge. If you would, Judge Green, just explain for us, what did you understand or come to learn why they were there?
Judge, that question calls for hearsay. I object.
Any response, Mr. Ashcraft?
No response, Judge.
Objection is sustained.
Thank you. Did you stay at the house on June 22nd?
No. We may have remained 10 or 15 minutes. I spoke to 1 or 2 of the officers, and everyone left. I got the impression that I got there that we had gotten there after the police and CPS were making a decision to leave.
Now, June 24, 2018 is a significant date. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell us about June 24 of 2018 as relates to Gary Sr., Katie, and his family.
Well, I was, Andre and I were at a church on the campaign trail. I believe that it was in Romulus. And we got a phone call from Gary Sr. asking us to come to the house and get the kids. He said the police were there. I don't recall if CPS was there yet. When we arrived, the on-call or weekend team was there, and the police. And then shortly after that, Ms. Apple arrived too. And I learned what the allegations were. I told the on-call investigator who I was to the children, and told her that Andre and I were prepared to take all 5 of them with us right then. And initially, I was given the runaround. I later learned that.
Objection to whatever she learned is hearsay.
Response. All right.
Go ahead.
You said you will move on. Do you have another question?
Yes. Did you have an opportunity to see the boys when you were there on June 24th?
I did see them. They wouldn't make eye contact, but well, maybe they didn't actually see me, but I saw them. And I was in the driveway, well, at the end of the driveway, and I saw them as they were coming out of the side door and being taken to a vehicle.
And were you offered an opportunity to be involved in whatever decisions were being made?
No, I did express that I wanted to plan for all 5 of the children, and I left because I understood that I would be contacted, that CPS needed to do some further investigation and make a placement decision.
Did you leave the home that day before or after the boys were removed?
We left at the same time. Because there were 5 of them, transportation had to be arranged. I believe China may have already come for Daisy prior to our arrival, because I don't remember seeing China there, but the other 4 children, 2 of them being babies, Daniel and Kayla, needed car seats, so we had to use multiple vehicles to transport them to different safety points. And the police vehicle was transporting Gary Jr. and Russell to our cousin April Green's house. And so Andre and I went to the ATM and got some cash and asked the police if they would send that with the boys so that April could use it to take care of the kids. And Daniel and Kaylin, they were in a separate vehicle, but I don't know where they went directly from the house. I know they ultimately were in their maternal aunt's home.
And were you subsequently invited by CPS to become involved in their work?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, subsequent to the removal of the boys from your son's custody, CPS conducted an investigation, is that right?
Yes,
And were you involved with regard to the investigation?
I did speak to them.
And how were you involved? Did you participate in any meetings, for example?
Yes, I participated in the family team meeting that occurred on June 26th. And I participated in a meeting with upper management on October 22nd, both of 2018. And I had at least 2 phone calls with Ms. Apple. I believe that the first was the same day as the family team meeting, or it was very soon after. So after the June 26th family team meeting. And specifically, I remember August 9th because we had a very, very long conversation. I was out of town. We were on vacation, Andre and I, and I received a text from Ms. Apple indicating that she needed to investigate some new allegations and that they included Andre and me.
Before we move to October, let's talk about the family team meeting on June 26th. What is a family team meeting?
Family team meeting is designed to get all of the stakeholders together to plan next steps for children. It's part of the investigation tool. It's not necessarily used to gather information, but it frequently is an investigation tool. And the parents or whoever the legal caregivers for the children are allowed to bring support persons. typically that would include relatives or neighbors, people who are close to the family, know, know about the family and can speak meaningfully about what's going on with the family, have some input into the placement determination, if there will be placement of the children outside of the home, and have some input so that CPS can determine what, if any, services are going to be provided to the family.
Is everyone during the family team meeting invited to speak?
Yes, everyone.
Did you have that opportunity?
Yes,
Was Corey Bressler there?
yes.
And do you know how she came to be involved in the family team meeting?
Well, I'm sure they contacted her by the AME CPS. They're required by law to contact non-custodial parents when they're investigating.
And you indicated that next, either the day of the FTM or shortly thereafter, you had a call with Ms. Apple, is that right?
Yes.
And what was the subject or the purpose first of the call?
I don't remember if she called me or I called her, so I can't remember the purpose. But I do recall sharing with her information during that call.
What did you tell her?
I told her about the handprint I saw.
What about the hand?
I told her that once I saw a handprint that I learned had been made by Gary Sr. on Gary Jr. And I don't know if I described it. I think I just said it was a handprint. I also told her, and these are things that I'm certain I told her. I also told her that I was very concerned about the children's safety in their mother's care because they hadn't seen her in 3 years, and I knew that she had challenges. And I don't think it was a very long phone call, but I remember discussing those two things specifically. And and that would also, I was going to say that would also have been the conversation where I told Ms. Apple my observations of the discipline that Gary Sr. used with the children. But I may have mentioned that also at the FTM, possibly both times actually, the FTM and the phone call after.
Did you come to learn at some point that you had been placed on something called central registry?
Yes.
When did you learn that?
I was in the juvenile courthouse waiting for one of my cases to be called. And I was paged over the intercom to come to a particular courtroom. That often happens. It often happens that attorneys are paged to courtrooms for various reasons, even if they don't expect that they'll be in that particular courtroom. I thought I might have left something the last time I was there, or I went. I didn't have any concern about going, but I had no idea who was paging me or why. I got to the courtroom. Ms. Apple was standing outside of the door, and Ms. Apple served me an envelope that contained a notice that I had been placed on Central Registry.
And tell us about central registry. What is it?
Central Registry is a database that's mandated by law, by Michigan law, to be maintained of people against whom abuse and neglect has been substantiated. And I think it's severe neglect, so abuse or severe neglect. And it's an entry on Central Registry almost without exception eliminates the possibility of children being placed with a particular person. So if that person is seeking placement, wants to plan for children, and his or her name is on central registry, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to obtain placement of the children with that kind of designation.
Did you say anything to Ms. Apple at that time?
Yes,
What did you say?
I asked her, why am I being placed on central registry, and what's the legal basis for my being placed on central registry? And she threw her hand.
Objection to whatever she said is hearsay.
I wasn't going to
She's not
say
testifying on what she said.
She just threw her hands up.
One moment. Any further objection?
No, if she's not repeating what Ms. Apple said, I have no objection.
Continue, please.
She threw her hands up and shook her head, as if to suggest, this isn't my decision. And she told me I needed to contact her supervisor if I wanted to discuss it further. That would have been Mary Kavanaugh, whom I met at the FTM.
And did you subsequently contact Ms. Kavanaugh?
Yes, I did.
What did you tell her?
I asked her, why was I placed on central registry? And she was.
Objection again to anything she says.
Response, if any.
She wasn't going to testify about what Ms. Kavanaugh said.
Continue.
I asked her why I was placed on central registry, and she was belligerent, actually. I could barely get a word in, and ultimately, I hung up. And I remember, I can't say what she said. So I hung up, and I just started calling up the chain of command. Wasn't able to reach anyone until I got to the county director, who was Annie Ray at the time.
And did you ultimately get to a conclusion with regard to the central registry issue?
Yes.
How did it conclude?
I was removed.
Were you removed as a favor?
Absolutely not.
Were you removed because you didn't belong on it?
That's why I was removed.
Since that time, has there been any issue associated with central registry in any respect?
No, not for me.
Now, did you allege bias as relates to Ms. Apple?
Yes, I did.
Tell us about
Ms.
that.
Apple and Ms. Kavanaugh. Well, I knew that Ms. Apple had a lot of, I knew that much of what Ms. Apple did was directed by Ms. Kavanaugh, just because I know the dynamics of supervision in DHSS. Ms. Apple did not investigate any of the material things that I needed her to investigate, that I begged her to investigate. The first being, because I was so concerned about the safety of Gary Jr. and Russell, and I believed then, and I'm still concerned, that they were living with a mother who had not only abandoned them, but who has very serious mental health challenges. And I knew that Corey had already been substantiated as having abused Gary Jr. with that black eye incident. And I've had my own encounters with Corey and violence. She attacked Andre and me in our own home. So I was very, very concerned. And Ms. Apple seemed to listen to what I was saying, and she implied that she would follow up on at least determining whether Corey had, because it had been 3 years, it was very possible that Corey could have received treatment, could have been in treatment. So she was going to investigate that. She told me that she was going to do that. She told me that she was going to.
Objection to the hearsay.
Response.
Move on, Judge.
All right.
Judge Green, did you come to find out that Ms. Apple had not investigated those things that you raised as concerns about the health, safety, and welfare of the boys in the custody of Corey.
Objection, that would be hearsay. She comes to learn because somebody tells her.
Not whether or not they were investigated. If she's aware of whether they were investigated, that's not something where we're making an assertion with regard to someone's statement or out of court statement.
It is. Whether CPS investigated, the only way she would know that is if someone told her that.
Any further response, Mr. Ashcraft? Objection is sustained.
Thank you. Go ahead, Judge. So you followed up and asked for someone to investigate those issues specifically, correct?
Yes.
And who did you call for that purpose?
Well, after I was informed by Ms. Gray that I was removed from Central Magistrate, she told me that Mr.
Objection
Kaiser-
again to whatever Ms. Gray said. Judge, the witness is a lawyer and a judge. She knows what hearsay is. Could you instruct her not to try to sneak in hearsay? I objected multiple times.
All right. Anything, Mr. Ashcraft?
Yes, Judge, I would appreciate the connotations and those kind of things being made from counsel table up here, be instructed not to occur, in fact. If there's an objection, state the objection as opposed to besmirching my client. She wasn't testifying about a specific statement. She was simply indicating what had occurred in response to the work that she did to try to get the matter investigated. She wasn't repeating anything specific that anybody said. It wasn't an out-of-court statement specifically being used for purposes of the truth of the statement.
All right, thank you. Most of us here in the courtroom are attorneys. I was going to say we all are, but I think that there are two who are not. Judge Green, I'm going to sustain that objection to hearsay and ask you to make sure you watch that. Continue.
Did you ultimately contact somebody else and make sure, or at least ask them to investigate these issues?
No, I was contacted.
You were contacted by somebody at CPS. Who contacted you?
Mr. Baker.
And was something done in terms of an arrangement for a meeting?
Yes, I was invited.
When did that occur?
October 22nd, 2018,
And where did the meeting take place?
at North Central District Child and Family Services.
And who was present?
Mr. Baker, Annie Ray, Lynette Wright, and Ms. McDougal.
And during that meeting, did you have an opportunity to address your issues of bias?
Yes.
Were they received by the people at the meeting?
Yes.
Was there any follow-up?
By follow-up, do you mean contacting me or?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I didn't call them.
You talked earlier about an email exchange that you had with Ms. McDougal.
Yes,
Did you initiate that email contact?
yes.
Why?
Well, I wanted to memorialize our conversation at the meeting and to share something that I forgot to mention at the meeting I thought was important.
And was the issues that were raised ultimately resolved?
Well, I understand that there was a re-investigation, but it wasn't a thorough investigation.
It wasn't a
It
what?
was not a thorough investigation.
Did you ever have additional contact with CPS after that, October 2018?
I don't think so.
Now, I want to talk about an amended complaint that was filed in this case after disciplinary counsel arrested their groups. And a third count was added in that amended complaint. In your answer to the original complaint, you indicated that you had told CPS of both observing the handprint on the cheek of Gary Jr. as well as applying makeup. Do you recall that?
Yes.
When did you file that answer to the original complaint?
That would have been, November 21st is sticking out in my head, but I know that's not. I think that it was December 31st of 2020.
And you verified your answer to the complaint, is that right?
I did.
And what did you understand you were doing when you verified your answer?
Asserting that everything that I stated in my answer was true.
True to the best of your knowledge and information?
Correct.
Now, disciplinary counsel called you as an adverse witness on September 17 of 2021 in this case. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you testified specifically with regard to your recollection related to the handprint and makeup issue. Do you recall that?
Yes.
If you would please share with Judge Widgeon your recollection with regard to whether or not you told CPS during the investigation of the handprint or the handprint and you applying makeup to the handprint.
Well, in my answer, in my original answer, I stated that I saw the handprint and that I applied makeup to it. But before that, I think I had 3 sets of questions. The first, second, and third, I only mentioned that I saw the handprint. At some point or another, I began to view the handprint and the makeup as a single act. But I was always focused on the handprint because it's the handprint that in my mind was critical to whether I had done anything wrong in CPS. It was the handprint that I knew if CPS had any concerns about me at all would be what they rested their concerns on, seeing that handprint. The makeup for me was always incidental. It wasn't even something that I remembered until after the juvenile court trial. I had to be reminded of the makeup. And it's because when I applied the makeup, I knew that I wasn't doing it for the reasons that I've been accused of doing it, which is to conceal abuse. So when I made my answer, each time I made my answer, I was answering to the best of my knowledge at that time. By the time that I testified on September 17th, I had heard numerous intimation by disciplinary counsel that I lied about telling CPS that I applied makeup. And it initially was very confusing for me because I told CPS about the handprint because I didn't want CPS to have to be able to say I held anything back because I knew they were going to investigate what I said about the handprint. I knew they would ask Gary Jr. I assumed that they would ask Russell. So I had no reason whatsoever to purposefully conceal from them anything about the makeup or to change my statement about the makeup. I didn't even realize that I had done that. My point is that each time that I gave an answer, whether it was written or in testimony. I was testifying to the best of my knowledge and my recollection. And on September 17th of this year, when I testified, I realized that, again, because the disciplinary council had raised it, that maybe I wasn't certain. I thought I was certain that I told Ms. Apple about the makeup. What I know I told her was about the handprint. And again, it's the handprint that I assumed CPS would definitely want to know about.
Are you certain today
About,
whether you told CPS about the handprint and the makeup, or are you uncertain?
I'm certain that I told them about the handprint. I'm not certain whether I told them about the makeup.
Disciplinary council filed an amended complaint that added a third count specifically addressing that issue. You have filed an answer to that, correct?
Yes,
And you verified your answer at the end of the document, yes?
yes.
And what did you, or how did you respond with regard to whether or not you told CPS about the handprint and the makeup?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. How?
In the answer that you just filed to the amended complaint, did you respond that you were uncertain about whether you told CPS about the makeup at the time you told them about the handprint?
Yes,
Now, I'm going to ask you some questions, Judge Green, specifically from the amended complaint that disciplinary council filed, okay? Between May 29, 2015 and June 24, 2018, were you aware whether your son was abusing your grandsons?
no, I was not.
During this time period, were you aware that your son was a very, quote, stern, close quote, or, quote, strong, close quote, disciplinarian?
Yes,
During this time period, were you aware that your son used corporal punishment on your grandsons?
no,
During this time period, were you aware that your son hit your grandsons with a belt?
I became aware when CPS began its investigation on June 24th of 2018. Prior to that, no, not ever.
During this time period, were you aware that your grandsons told you that they had been spanked by their father on numerous occasions?
During the period of 2015 to 2018,
Yes.
no,
During this time period, did your grandsons express to you their concern about what would happen to them physically if their father learned that they had misbehaved at home?
no. They had expressed on occasion their concern about being in trouble when they got home if they misbehaved, but never being in trouble physically. They never said anything like that to me.
During this time period, did you ever hear your son slap Gary Jr. across the face hard enough to leave a handprint, which you later concealed with makeup?
No,
During this time period, did you see any other marks on Gary Jr.'s face on other occasions that he told you had been inflicted by his father?
no,
During this time period, did Russell ever show you bruises on his body and tell you that they had been inflicted by his father?
no,
During this time period, when Russell was around 8 years of age, did he tell you that he was about to be spanked by his father?
yes,
And when he told you that, did you leave the home before the spanking took place?
I don't know. because I never witnessed a spanking. I did leave the home. I remember this incident very well.
Tell us about it, please.
I popped in to visit. Gary and Russell were in their bedroom. Russell was on punishment, was being disciplined. I don't remember if Gary was too, but they were both in the room. Russell was definitely confined. And I asked him, "Why are you in trouble?" He told me, and he said, "And Dad's going to give me a spanking." He may have even said whoop, but I believe that he said spanking. Anyway, I knew that his dad wasn't supposed to be using corporal punishment at all. So I told him, "Oh, no, he won't. He's just saying that to you." Taking in mind what it was that Russell was in trouble about. I knew his father was probably pretty angry. But I said, "He's not going to spank you." And I said that with confidence because I knew about court order. But just to be sure, I went to him. He was there in the house. And I asked him, "What is this that Russell's saying about he's about to get a whooping or spanking, whatever the term was?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to do that, Mom. I just wanted to scare him." He said, "There's only so much that I can do." I didn't even leave immediately. I stayed for a little while longer, went downstairs and said goodbye to my mother, and I left. And I never heard anything about it again until these proceedings.
During this time period, Judge Green, did your grandsons tell you that they had been spanked by their father on other occasions?
No,
During this time period, on multiple occasions, did you see injuries on the face of Gary Jr.?
I never saw injuries on the face of Gary Jr. or Russell. I never saw anything that left a mark because of discipline, ever.
Other than the handprint that you talked about earlier today, did Gary Jr. ever tell you that he had been injured or beaten by his father?
No, he mentioned, all Gary Jr. ever complained about was Katie. But he never even said that Katie had done anything physical to him. He would just complain about her being mean.
During the time period of July 2014 and June 24 of 2018, were you aware that your son was prone to abusive behavior?
No,
Were you aware that on multiple occasions your son had been abusive to Katie
no.
by slapping and choking her?
I knew that there had been a choking incident, or at least the allegation of a choking incident. And may I elaborate about that? So I don't remember if I picked the kids up or if they met me at church, but when I saw them at church, they told me that their father had choked Katie, and they used the expression choked her out. And they told us, well, I'm saying us because Andre was there, but I'm not actually sure if he was part of this conversation. He was actually there somewhere in the church. So they did tell me that, but they also told me that they did not see it. And I knew that both Gary Sr. and Katie would try to pit the children against not each other, but not each other meaning Gary and Russell, but they would try to pit the children against the other parent. I learned that they learned about the choking from Katie. I didn't ask Katie about it.
Objection to the hearsay, and yes, that be stricken.
Response.
We'll move on, Judge.
I'm sorry.
The objection is sustained. Let's
Judge, would
move
you
on.
strike that from the record?
It is stricken. Continue.
Thank you. Let's go back to the amended complaint. During the period of May 2015 and through June of 2018, were you aware that your son was under a court order not to use corporal punishment?
Yes,
During that same period, were you aware of various indicia of abusive punishments to your grandsons by way of your son?
no,
During this time period, did you on multiple occasions put makeup on Gary Jr.'s injuries
no,
and do so in an attempt to conceal injuries?
absolutely not.
Have you ever made false statements about your knowledge, whether your son had abused your grandsons?
No,
You testified during the March 2019 juvenile court hearing, you recall that?
yes,
Did you make a false statement when you testified that there were not times that Gary Jr. showed you bruises on his body?
no, I didn't.
Same question with regard to that you did not use makeup to cover up Gary Jr. and Russell's bruises?
No.
And that Gary Jr.'s testimony that you did cover up bruises on his face with makeup was a lie?
I did testify that, yes.
With regard to your December 31, 2020 answer to complaint in this case, did you make a false statement knowingly by saying that you told CPS both of the handprint and applying makeup?
No, I didn't.
Was the statement false and misleading at that time?
No, it was what I believed was true at the time.
And you have clarified that today?
Yes,
Judge Green, do you have a relationship with your grandsons now?
well, I'll always have a relationship because they're my grandchildren, but I do not see them. Well, I don't see Gary, Russell, Kaylin, and Daniel. I do see Daisy and Ziggy and Julian.
You heard Gary Jr. and Russell's testimony in this case, yes?
Yes,
Does that change your opinion as to whether or not you would like to maintain a relationship with them?
no,
Why not?
they're my grandchildren. I love them. I want to be in their life. I know that despite everything that has happened, that I could be very, very beneficial to them. That I could offer them things that probably no one else in the world can offer to them. I can be of positive influence on them and support their dreams. And I would love the opportunity to do that.
Were you ever aware that your grandsons were being physically abused at the hand of your son?
No, I was never aware. And if I if I had even suspected, I would have done something about it. It would have been so easy for me to do. I would have, on a visit to my home, told my son, they're not coming back. And there wouldn't have been anything that he or Katie could have done, because if they called the police were going to talk to me, and that would start a CPS investigation. So I knew that anything that I determined needed to be done by way of any intervention would be successful. I had absolutely no concerns about those children. They were happy, loving, normal boys.
Other than the handprint that you described, did you ever apply makeup to a mark on the body of either Gary Jr. or Russell?
Never.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, it is now just after 1 o'clock. Our usual procedure has been to take a lunch break around the middle of the day for about half an hour and then come back. How is it that you'd like to proceed today?
It's fine with me, Judge.
It's fine.
All right, so we would take a lunch break until just after 1:30 and then come back to have you proceed with any cross-examination. Meanwhile, again, if you find out anything about the issue that we're trying to research with respect to those dates, let me know that as soon as we come back.